by the Research Center for East Asian Studies. And my name is Xin Pan. I will be the host today. I'm Assistant Professor of Sociology at Soochow University. And today we're very glad to have Dr. Andrew Oros to present on aging allies and alliances in the Indo-Pacific. And Professor Oros is a Japanese specialist. His comparatives of East Asian politics, and he does interdisciplinary studies of sociology and political science. He has published widely on Japanese public politics before, and then today he's going to present some of the content is his upcoming book. A working project on Americans' aging allies in Asia, demographic change and national security in the Indo-Pacific. And he has written intensively on Japan's security renaissance, where normalized Japan politics identity and the evolution of security practice. He is also the co-author of Global Security Watch of Japan. And today we're very glad to have him here to present his latest work on this. And Taiwan is one of the most important cases in his new book. And Andrew, the floor is all yours.
Thank you very much. I'm very happy to be in Taiwan virtually. I had hoped to be in Taiwan in person at this time, but I look forward to hopefully visiting next year when it's a little safer. And perhaps some of you in the audience will be able to also come visit in the United States next year sometime when it's safer, or in other places in Asia. I'm going to Korea next month to do research on this project, and then I hope to go to Japan as well as to Taiwan next summer. Let me share my screen now so you can see some of my slides. I also, for the students in the audience, I want to give some special encouragement to listening to lectures online in English. If English is not your native language, it's good practice, and I know it can be a little challenging, so please use the slides to help as well. But give me a moment here to open that up. I think, here we go. So as Professor Pan mentioned, can you just confirm you can see the slides?
Yes, we can see that.
Great. So you can see the title of my lecture here, and I chose these two photographs to sort of juxtapose the two different aspects of a vibrant Indo-Pacific between, rapid aging and also growing youth populations, and also new connections between young people, like, for example, in this Australia-Indonesia Young Leaders Workshop. I want to thank you for the invitation. As I said, it's great to be able to meet people virtually, even if we can't be in person just yet. Because our time is rather short, I'll just jump right into my talk now. But as you can see, my plan is to give you a few general statistics about demographic change and how this relates to the Indo-Pacific, then spell out some of my research questions, share some of my initial findings that I've had in my work so far, and some of the policy implications. And then I look forward to your questions and comments and suggestions. So the first statistic I'll show you is my starting point really came from Japan. As Professor Pan said, is kind of my core specialty. And Japan is at the leading edge of what is unprecedented demographic change, something that we've never experienced in human history. And Japan is at the start of that, of a rapid aging society and an actually shrinking population. So today, there are about 1.5 million fewer Japanese in the world than there were a decade ago because of their shrinking population. And this population loss is going to accelerate dramatically in the coming decades. I downloaded this visual graphic from the World Economic Forum because I think it really conveys a little more emotionally how many people will be lost. So these bars show the size of major cities in the world, and it correlates to how many Japanese will disappear from the planet over the next 30 years. So populations the size of Los Angeles, which is my hometown, or Taipei will just be gone. But Also very important to my project, though, is that Japan is not the only one. So Japan was at the leading edge, but all of Japan's neighbors will experience workforce shrinkage and rapid aging of their populations in this decade. So that's China, Korea, Taiwan, and Russia as well. North Korea is a little bit slower case. It's the same general direction, but not quite as advanced. So to give you another kind of statistic you can see above, the combined populations of Japan, Russia, and China will lose over 100 million people in the next 30 years. I mean, that's a dramatic amount of people in my view. And if we want to limit it to the size of a workforce, you can see the graph in the middle that shows the projected Chinese population age 20 to 59, the working age population. And look at that huge drop in the working age population over the next several decades. Meanwhile, though, in the broader Indo-Pacific region, we see actually population growth, and Asia as a whole will grow by about 700 million people in this by 2050, so in just the next 30 years. And the number one growth place is India, Indonesia also very high. And that means that also working age populations will be growing. What you can see, the graph on the screen, is worldwide projected growth. So actually, Africa is where you'll see the most population growth in the world, but Asia is also growing. And the United States also is growing. And so it's sort of the demographic exception among the advanced countries of the world. The US is the only advanced power in the world today that is increasing in population. So we should have a population increase of about 50 million by 2050. So literally every other major power, the United Kingdom, France, Germany, Italy, Japan, China, Russia, all will have population shrinkage in this period. So what I'm interested in, and I'll talk to you a little more about today, is how this is going to affect the security relationships in the Indo-Pacific, including, of course, Taiwan. We could talk in Q&A about non-security issues, economic issues, societal issues. It's going to have big implications overall, but my focus is on the security realm. So I'm not the only person, of course, that's interested in this topic. And back about a decade ago, demographers predicted what would happen in this past decade. They predicted that super aging that would happen. They predicted that Japan's population would shrink. They predicted population growth in places like the Middle East and Africa. And so scholars began to wonder what the effect would be. And so there's a literature of a number of books that link to this question worldwide. But the main findings are that the security implications globally have to do with huge population growth in places like Africa and the Middle East. And so what I was curious about is what will the implications be in the Indo-Pacific, where we don't have that kind of huge growth? Meanwhile, also in the Indo-Pacific, as all of you in Taiwan are well aware of, there are still many traditional security threats in the region. It's not sort of a zone of peace like in the European Union. So China's increasing military assertiveness is a big concern across the region, and of course with Taiwan. The sort of standoff between Taiwan and China over the future of Taiwan is a hard security issue. Challenges over territorial claims in the East and South China Sea, nuclear weapons concerns with North Korea, weapons proliferation. So there's increased defense spending around the region, concerns about piracy. So this is a sort of part of the world that, although there's been a long period of peace in East Asia, there are growing security tensions. And my question that I'm interested in is how the demographic change we're going to experience will affect that. So for those of you who are a little bit more research methodology focused, I know Professor Pan is a very sophisticated in methodology, so I'll just make clear that what I'm interested in is demographic change as the independent variable. So it is what's changing and what's affecting the dependent variable, which are security policy decisions by states, like the level of defense spending, the security strategies they're setting out, and also their actual conduct. And what I see in between, the so-called intervening variables, are the political and cultural systems of these states. So these systems filter demographic pressure into actual security policy. So to give one example just up front, it seems very logical that all of these countries that are experiencing rapid aging and population shrinkage would use women more efficiently in their societies. But that's not, in fact, what we see. We see that to some degree, but the willingness of societies to adapt and to use female labor more efficiently is limited by cultural systems, and that's something I might talk about. But what I'm not trying to do is explain why the demographics have shifted in such a negative way. So that would be using demographic change as the dependent variable. So for example, explaining why are birth rates so low, or why do societies in Northeast Asia generally not have high immigration to offset that? So those are different questions that I'm not examining in my study. So before I get to some of my findings, let me spend just a few minutes talking about this idea of an Indo-Pacific region, because in the realm of military security, this is sort of a newer conception of thinking about security in the area. Traditionally, for the last 50 years, the US has been focused especially on Northeast Asia and to some extent East Asia broadly, including Southeast Asia. Of course, the US fought a war in Vietnam, for example, in Southeast Asia. But now increasingly, the US is thinking of the region more broadly, as are other countries in the region, Japan, Australia, and in Taiwan, of course, there's the kind of new southward policy that thinking more towards the region as a whole. But it turns out it's a little bit tricky to define what the region is, what countries count in the region and don't. So I want to show you a few examples of that and show you some of the demographic variation. If you're interested in this, those of you in the audience, and you'd like to learn about some other countries, if you Google my name and the Wilson Center, where I'm a fellow now, I have a blog post on the Wilson Center site called Asia Dispatches, and there are a whole set of interactive maps where you can kind of slide a bar back and forth to see how fast aging will happen. You can click on each country and it will pop up a box with demographic data for each country. So I've done that for 30 countries and territories around the Indo-Pacific. But my focus, as I'll show you, is on what I call the Indo-Pacific 16, the IP16. And then separately, I have another category, the OIP, Other Indo-Pacific 14, that I have demographic data for, but I'm not going to be spending as much time with in my study. Because of time, I'm not going to read this whole slide, but you can see there's a list of the countries in each category. The IP16 is by far the largest group. So it's 3.8 billion people live in the IP16. And in the OIP14, it's just 316 million people. So it's less than a tenth of the size. So I'm focusing on the largest population countries and the countries that affect the security of the Indo-Pacific the most. So for example, the IP16 constitutes about 30% of total world defense spending. The OIP14 is just 1% of world defense spending. So I'm sort of putting that aside. So now if we continue the focus on the IP16, here's a kind of demographic breakdown of these countries on the areas that I'm especially interested in, which is about rapid aging or youth and the total population size. So what's striking to me is that there are 6 countries who are mostly the main regional players in security, all of them with shrinking and rapidly aging populations. So you can see that list at the top. The US allies are in red. So Japan, South Korea, Taiwan, Thailand, China, and Russia, all with shrinking and rapidly aging populations over the next 30 years. Then you can see the other diversity within this broader Indo-Pacific grouping. You have North Korea, which is very similar to the other 6, but just not quite as far along in terms of aging and shrinking. But then by contrast, you have 5 states that are growing in population and have very youthful populations. And these are India, Indonesia, the Philippines, which is a US ally, Vietnam, and Malaysia. And then you have these 4 other countries you can see on the list. Australia is also growing because of immigration, but it's aging rapidly. And then there are 2 smaller countries like that are growing but aging, and that's New Zealand and Singapore. Also because of immigration, they're growing. And then there's a kind of outlier, which is Mongolia, which is a smaller country, but it's growing and youthful. So I dwell on this to show you that although in Northeast Asia, most of the countries have a very similar experience. In the Indo-Pacific, if we think about the region, it's a much more diverse picture. So now let me tell you a little bit about the cases that I've studied so far. And I think the first thing I want to say is, even though I'm just 24/7 obsessed about demography right now, and I'm doing it every day, it's not explaining everything, right? The demography itself is not destiny. Just because you have an aging society or a shrinking population does not mean that you're in a lot of trouble. The question is, how are policymakers going to address the challenges they face? Will they make good policy or not good policy? And I think scholars also need to pay more attention to this question as we analyze the security environment in the Indo-Pacific. So let me give you an example about demography, not destiny. You can see a picture of the cover of my last book, Japan's Security Renaissance, which I published in 2017. And what's intriguing is, I call it the paradox of a stronger Japan. So as you can see on the slide, I note that as Japan experienced its first decade of super aging and its population shrinkage, so super aging began in Japan in 2005, and the population began to shrink in 2009. So we're over 10 years after that. And the literature I pointed to you to earlier suggested that this aging society would be less interested in defense. But what's actually happened is Japan has become more capable than ever in their military. It's what I call the security renaissance in Japan. So that's an anomaly, right? But as we look forward in the future decade, I question in my new project whether Japan can continue to increase its defense spending as its population decline accelerates. And I'll also note that South Korea and Taiwan are starting to age and workforce shrinking much more recently, but also very recently, both countries are increasing their defense spending. So it's also contrary to what you would expect on the surface, at least from the demographic trends. Let me give you another example of an effect that I have seen in my research. So Japan doesn't technically have an army or navy. They call their forces their self-defense forces, the Jieitai. But they've had real challenges filling the ranks with their soldiers. And these challenges have worsened since 2006. If you look at a graph of their challenges, it gets worse in 2006, and that's right when Japan's experiencing super aging. So let me give you some numbers, and I'll compare it to the Taiwan case. So in Japan, the group of Japanese between 18 and 26 years old, which is the prime pool to recruit new soldiers, it peaked in 1994. So that's several decades ago, right? And as a result, the Japan Self-Defense Forces, the JFDS, began to reduce the number of troops they sought to recruit. So every single year from 1996 to 2005, they lowered the target of how many soldiers they wanted as the population was aging. But they still didn't meet those targets. And I'll notice that more recently, in the case of Taiwan, starting around 2017, Taiwan is doing the same thing. It's reducing the targeted size of their forces as the population that fits the military age group shrinks. I'll come back to Taiwan in a moment, but to finish up on Japan, in the most recent statistics, it's looking for a force of about 247,000 people, and it managed about 20,000 less than that. And that's in total, but actually the younger recruits, it's an even bigger shortfall. And I think this challenge is going to become even more problematic for Japan as its population begins to shrink more rapidly. So nearby Japan, and if we get to the Taiwan case, the other countries sort of similar to Japan demographically, like South Korea, Taiwan, and Singapore, all have had conscription or required military service in order to deal with recruiting challenges. And what I find interesting in my research is you might think that as the population begins to shrink, that conscription would be a really good thing, because then you can be sure you're getting people to fill those ranks. But actually, all three countries are moving away from conscription despite the population challenges, which is also, I think, somewhat different than logic would expect. And Taiwan is the most extreme case because it's phasing out conscription entirely to rely on a volunteer force like we have in the United States. In the case of South Korea, they're shortening the term that males have to serve in the military. So it's a kind of relaxing of conscription. But if you look at the Taiwan case, the type is probably kind of small for you to see on these slides in red, but I'll read out to you. It's a pretty big reduction. So over just 3 years, the target went from 275,000 to 165,000, so 110,000 fewer. But I think it's not such a surprise if you look at the demographics. So if you look at that next line, or I'll read to you, in 2030, the number of Taiwanese men between the ages of 15 and 29 will be estimated to be 1.68 million. And in 2015, it was 2.43 million. So that's a really big drop in the number of men in that target population. So one obvious solution to that is to include more women. And to Taiwan's credit, I'll just use my own moral calculus. I think women should be given the same opportunities as men. That between the cases of Taiwan, South Korea, and Japan, Taiwan has the largest number of women serving in their forces, and it's been increasing. So in just the last 7 years, it's gone up from 15,000 to 23,000. And so the total number of women in the forces was 12.4% in 2019. And I imagine that's going to increase more moving forward. So let me wrap up for the last 5 minutes or so, talking a little more about kind of the military dimension of this. And I'll just say that something that I'm looking at, and we could talk about more in Q&A if you'd like, is that what I will argue is that all military security is not the same in terms of needing people to fight or to defend. So for example, protecting a land border can involve more men and women than a maritime border where you're largely protecting through ships, for example. Or conducting offensive operations like invading an island is going to take more people than defending an island from being attacked, right? Also, the number of people you need in a peacetime operations is different than in wartime operations. So part of what I'm doing in my book is kind of spelling out some of these scenarios and looking at, you know, who is benefiting and who is more challenged based on some of the specific security threats that each state faces. So that brings us to China, which is a state that is perceived as threatening, of course, by Taiwan, but also by Japan and to some degree by South Korea. So as China is pursuing military modernization. It also is following this pattern of reducing the total number of personnel in their military to have a smaller, more professional force. And here again, I want to remind you that in my book argument and what I'm telling you today, I'm not saying that everything is about demographics. So what we can see is China has been reducing the size of its military for decades now. And so this clearly is not just because the number of Chinese is reducing, because the number has only recently begun to reduce. But I do think it's in line with demographics. And looking ahead, China will face the same kind of problem that Japan is already facing, which is it will increasingly have labor shortages as its working age population shrinks. And also it will have increasing costs of supporting a more elderly population. So I'll give you one statistic you can see at the bottom of this slide. China's population over 64 years old will double in the next 30 years. It will go from 172 million roughly today to over 365 million elderly people. And I'm very happy that we have some Taiwanese professor specialists joining us today, but one is a specialist in pension policy, and I imagine he would have something to say about this level of change in such a short amount of time. It's certainly going to cause challenges for China, and I believe it will have implications for China's military, but this is not until the 2030s. So what this means, I think, in terms of my research, is that what I predict from these demographics is that the 2020s, so this next sort of 8 or 9 years, I think is going to be especially unpredictable and challenging in the Indo-Pacific security environment. So this is the decade that South Korea, Taiwan, China, and Russia will all follow Japan into super aging and population shrinkage. And again, in all of human history, we have no experience with this. This has never happened before. So we don't really know what will happen. But one thought is that it may be that as these states look ahead to a much more challenging future, they may try to lock in security gains in the short term while they're still comparatively robust. And we did see this behavior by Russia earlier in the 2010s, as it was experiencing its first decade of shrinkage. You could see a very belligerent set of actions that Russia took related to Crimea, the eastern Ukraine, much more aggressive cyber activities. And in the case of Japan that I study closely, Russian fighter jets and ships repeatedly would test Japan's air and sea defenses at a level that hadn't been seen since the Cold War. So again, this is different than you would have expected an aging society to conduct. And so one of my questions is this just a transitional factor, and what can we expect in the future? In the case of Taiwan, I'd also like to mention a couple of non-demographic factors that affect Taiwan's security policy in particular. Something that we talk a lot about in the United States as we look to China is President Xi's seeming desire to be the president for life, kind of like Vladimir Putin in Russia. And there's a lot of expectation that he may seek to serve a third term as president in China in 2027. And so there's concern about what kinds of actions he might take in advance of 2027 to seem like a strong president who deserves to serve longer. And I worry that there could be a security challenge there. Another challenge that Taiwan faces as China seeks to shrink Taiwan's international space is a logical thing for states that are experiencing aging and shrinking to do is to expand partnerships with other states to sort of bolster up their defenses. But as you all know, China has sort of restricted Taiwan's ability to have robust international space to create security partnerships, for example. But it hasn't been totally successful in that. And one area, well, a couple of areas I think that are promising is, more recently, Japan has expressed interest in having more security cooperation with Taiwan in certain cases. The US, I think, has sort of championed concerns about Taiwan with European allies, for example. So there is some positive progress in that way. I'm going to just wrap up here now with a few final comments. A very big area of my research that I have not stressed today, but we could talk more about, is how technology can offset some of the challenges of shrinking populations. So for example, robotics and other unmanned systems, artificial intelligence, using sometimes robotics and unmanned systems, other kinds of labor-saving practices are surely going to help countries like Japan and Taiwan move through this demographic transition. But what I would say just briefly for now is that in the area of military security, these new technologies also have the flip side that they themselves are altering the landscape of security. So the fact that you have unmanned systems also creates new security problems, or artificial intelligence also creates new security challenges, or of course cyber. We're all aware of how cyber challenges have been present in terms of security. Also, I showed the challenges about personnel a few slides ago, but I'll also note that in terms of military training, what all of the militaries of the advanced countries are finding is that they need their troops to stay in the military longer in order to master these advanced technologies. So I think this is one of the main reasons why conscription is not so popular anymore, because having people come in and serve just 6 months or 1 year and then coming out, it's not efficient for training in advanced technologies. I write more about this aspect, the technological aspect, in an article I published in the journal Global Asia in June of 2021. So if you want to read more about the technology aspects, you can Google that. It's a free download. And so in conclusion, let me just sum up with a few points. The number one point that I think I've taken from my research so far is that conflict among the most advanced states in the Indo-Pacific, such as those in Northeast Asia, is definitely going to employ fewer of the declining number of human beings, and it's going to rely much more on autonomous systems, on robotics and artificial intelligence to counter threats as we look forward in the next several decades. Now, this shift is due more to technological change than it is to demographics, but the demographics also are playing a role. I'll also note as a kind of concluding point that some US allies and partners are already struggling to meet military manpower quotas, such as Japan and Taiwan, and also to pay for new weapon systems as there's a demand for greater spending on elderly related spending. And I think that this struggle is going to intensify in the 2020s, in particular for Japan and South Korea. And by contrast, states, already large population states like India and Indonesia, the Philippines and such, are going to experience youth bulges and will be more attractive security partners moving forward because of it. There are some wildcards we could discuss. We're in the middle of a global pandemic right now that none of us expected a couple of years ago that has security implications. There could be something even more serious in the future. There are other ways that populations can be disrupted, like through a nuclear accident or intentional nuclear weapons, through biological or chemical incidents. So it is possible that the demographics will massively change compared to what we expect, but I don't think it's very likely. It's also possible that longer-term technologies will affect things like fertility, or maybe make elderly people much more productive, like through medication or robotics. But I think this is much further off. And of course, military technology continues to evolve. And in the worst case scenario, in terms of wildcards, we could have a major war in this region in the short term, and then that will change demographics, of course, and the security calculus. So my last slide here, what I'm going to be doing next in my research that we could talk about. I mentioned at the outset of this talk that I'm going to Korea next month. I'll spend a month in Korea learning more about their experiences with changing demographics. Then hopefully I'm going to get to Hanoi in Vietnam and Bangkok in Thailand, one of America's aging allies down south, around in the spring of next year. And then hopefully I'll maybe see some of you in person in Taipei next summer, along with going to Tokyo. And separately, on a related project, I've begun to work with Professor Pan, using some of her innovative experimental survey techniques to think about the effect of one-child families on military security in the area. We're interested, for example, in whether we can see correlations about willingness to fight or patriotism across age groups in these countries. And the plan is to wrap up this book project by the end of next summer and to submit it off for peer review. So thank you so much for listening to my remarks. I'd love to hear your questions and comments. If you'd like to read a little bit more about what I was talking about today, there's a few examples of some shorter articles I've written so far. And also, I'll just remind you, you can see some interactive maps about demographics on my Wilson Center site. So thank you again for listening. And I think I'll turn off the screen sharing now.
Well, thank you, Andrew, for your talk. That's a very inspiring and timely issue of our time. Oftentimes in Taiwan, whenever we talk about the like low birth rate, it's a national crisis. Oftentimes it refers to economic crisis rather than national security crisis, as we refer to it. But it's actually has implications for our national security. So next, we're going to have Professor Lin and Professor Zheng to raise questions. Which one of you would like to go first? Maybe Professor Zheng.
It's really nice to hear this lecture, because this is a question when I study low fertility. Sometimes occurred to me. I'm not expert of like security, but sometimes occurred to me that if every country has so few young men, and will they go to war? I mean, that's just, so I think that's really wonderful, study, because it really touch because when we talk about security, we often look at every factor other than the demography. And when we look at demography, we really think about the implication for security. So if there's a question, I think I can, because I learned a lot from this lecture. And the question, I think the question is, first is, I think you may, or a kind of a suggestion is that you may think about, I mean, it's right to look at the whole number of people. But also you can look a little bit about the family structure. I mean, for example, in the past, a military is always important for, frankly speaking, for poor family to get kind of middle class. I mean, even in US, that's the case. You got military pay the tuition and a lot of. In China, it's the same, right? You enter in military, you get Soochow in the city. And so I think that's kind of why the military kind of shrunk in so many countries. Probably not only because they are the number is smaller, but also like because the family structure changed. Now each household has fewer children, like 2 or 1.2 or 3. It's not like the previous generation. You have like 5 or 6 in a house in a family. So like like one of them will go to military to support the family or things like that. This kind of incentive kind of is decreasing. I mean, in many places. So I think that I think you are right that we have fewer people, but also the family structure and more middle class family, they are not willing to send their children to military to like improve their household, so the economy. So that's my first question or comment, I can think. The second thing, I'm wondering how the physical structure, because I think Professor Oros is expert in Japanese politics. I mean, the age in the first thing is always how much you want to spend on the older generation. Like you have rising medical bill, and you have the rising need for like long-term care, and especially when the family change. In the past, you have like 4 or 5 children. the most in the East Asian, most either they are supported by their children. But increasingly, that will become a problem because many either people, they have like a much fewer number of children. So that will be also, I believe, some like a more indirect route to influence the security, because the state, not only because you have more aging people, but also these people are less likely to support it by their children. So that you have a very hard dilemma to how to spend. And of course, like in South Korea, Taiwan, and Japan, these are democratic countries. They face the pressure from the general public. But also in China, I'm not quite sure how strong the pressure is. But some of my friends from China, they told me that, and people begin worry about their aging, their life, their economic security after retirement. In the past, first they are supported by children, but we now know that they have one-child policy and so. And the second thing is people now have higher expectation. In the past, you say that in the past, if you got sick and you don't get the treatment, that's the fate, that's your fate. But now increasing people, those middle class in the cities, they may have stronger reaction to this kind of news. That's what he observed in China, that people have get a stronger response to the news that there are some old people, they cannot get the medical treatment, they cannot get the support, is like that. So I think that China, because that's a major threat, and he is not a democratic country. So I'm also curious how the dynamics will different, because like I said, then other three major democratic countries in Northeast Asia. So that's my two comment and the question. Thank you.
So Andrew, would you like to address the questions now, or would you like to take more questions and answer them all?
But why don't we take at least a few more, and then maybe I can respond in some themes. But I appreciate those comments. I've taken many notes.
So next is Professor Lin, and then the next will be Professor Ye. So Professor Lin, please.
I'm very glad to learn a lot from Professor Andrew Oros, and I believe that most of the area of conflicts, they will they have a consensus that aging is a good thing, is a peacemaker for international relations in the long run, in a very, very long run. So there are some reasons that why aging can reduce violence, any kinds of violence. In fact, it's not only international conflicts, but also criminal and the other kinds of even household violence will be reduced because of aging. But there are some reasons. First, of course, in the very beginning, people think that this is a biological. There are some biological reasons that if you have more young male adults, the society will be, have more conflicts for some reason. There are also, aging will also change the family decision. If you have a lot of young kids, you may agree that some of them can become a soldier or become a general or commander. That may be a good thing for you, for the earning of the household. But if you have a few kids, then one son or one daughter, then you may consider that if it's a good thing or bad thing for the child to become join the military. So this is the second issue, that the family aging is a good thing for the family decision, that will reduce the incentive to join the military, also reduce the possibility of the government to get more personnel for the military. And also it will lead to sort of physical problem for the government when they face an aging issue, because they have to put more money into pension and healthcare system, not to fund the military. So it will reduce they may have to even reduce the budget for the military and move the budget to feed in the aging population. So there are also economic reasons that I believe in the late 21st century, we will see that the shrinking of economic size of the East Asian countries with their shrinking population. Although the GDP per capita may be increased, but basically the whole GDP size may be reduced. So facing that tough situation, even the industry have to face the labor shortage. So they will raise their wage salary payment to keep their workers in the factory not flow into the military. So there are a lot of reasons why that aging is a good thing, even in East Asia in the long run. Even in China, all these 4 reasons will lead to give them some pressure that they have to reduce the size of the military. Also include the personnel and budget. But as you say that the problem will happen in the recent 1 decade or maybe 15 years, because the real pressure is that if China want to do something to expand their power in East Asia, then they face the constraint of aging. So the time is not in the side of China, but in the side of the United States. So I think that the real problem will happen in a relatively short period. That recently we have to manage the problem. That Taiwan have a shrinking population, so shrinking population of the military, and we need personnel, we need skill, we need new technology. And but I have some thoughts that maybe this crisis could be manageable because we have a sort of possibility to increase to keep the size of the personnel that the military need. For example, as you have mentioned, we can recruit more female soldiers and commanders and officers, and we can extend the age of retirement for the soldiers. Now they are basically in the camps. And also we can extend the Army reserve age, because now we have a 45 or 50 that you don't have to be the reserve, but you can extend it to 60. So and also we have, if all these things does not work, we can still use something like the French military. They use the migration to become also embedded in the United States. A lot of new second generation, maybe they'll join the military to change their social class, like Professor Chen have mentioned. So we do have some strategies. First one is to recruit more people from Taiwan, and also extend the Army reserve and extend the age of retirement. And if all these things does not work, we can use maybe new migrant or new migrants to recruit them to become increase the payment and also increase the personnel that the military need. And the technology, I think that I'm not quite sure. Also, as you mentioned, the effect of do you need more expensive personnel for the military to operate these new technologies? It doesn't really, reduce the pressure of the budget that we need. So this is some thinking that just when I listen to your lecture and learn a lot, and also I think that there are some strategies that could be applied to keep it's manageable. The problem of the military personnel is still manageable in the next decade. But as in long run, it may be the problem may be more serious for China. So this is the first thing that I have now. Yeah.
Well, thank you, Professor Lin, and thank you for your comments. And next, Professor Yet, please.
Hello, hello, can you hear me? Yeah, can you hear me, right? Yeah, my question is quite simple. I have the two questions. One is about the demography projection, because your research based on correct demography projection or forecasting, right? And however, we also know we don't trust China's data, because as I told you, many years ago, I attended a conference, and there's a speaker say China's fertility rate is not trustable, because there are many projections from the 1.1 to the 2.2, 2.1. Yeah, so if Chinese data is not trustable, how can you predict predict their policy, or predict their policy or their action, military action, and so on. So how can you solve this problem? Because the Chinese data is quite untrustable. And another question is about because of the, you also said because of the population aging, so the military modernization is needed, not only for Taiwan but also for China and the other Eastern Asia countries. However, the military modernization need a lot of money. Yeah. And however, at the same time, population aging also causes the increase in social spending. For example, in Taiwan, we have the long-term care policy, we have the healthy policy, we have the pension policy, and this policy also for the elderly people. And we have the need to spend a lot of money on the elderly people. For example, the Taiwan pension would have the more than 50 trillion. Yeah, it's not billion, it's trillion. Yeah, NT dollar steps in the next 50 years. So we don't have the money to spend on the military policy or the defense policy. So I think there's a big trade-off between the social policy and the military modernization. I just want to know, because you only focus on the defense policy, so but my research interest in social policy. So I'm just thinking about how can we solve this trade-off in the near future, especially we are facing the threat of the China. Yeah, especially there is a nervous relation between the China, Taiwan, and the USA. Yeah, I just want to know what's your opinion about this. Yeah, thank you.
Well, thank you for Professor's for comments. And Andrew, the floor is yours.
Great, thank you so much for 3 sets of very insightful comments and questions. In general, I sort of agree with the thrust of all 3 sets of questions, but let me respond to some of them in just kind of not the same order as they were asked, but if maybe I'll start with the sort of last set of comments about the pension issue. I think that's a good illustration of a broader point that I want to make in my book. And I think at this point, I'm still halfway through my research, so I'm not as confident, but it seems to me that what's surprising to me in my research so far is that the pressures of changing demographics have not led to big policy shifts at this point. But my sense, and it seems the 3 of you would agree, is that what has worked so far in kind of incremental change to demographics is probably not going to work like 15 years from now. And the pension is a good example of that. Professor Pan mentioned that I'm Japan specialist at heart, and so I can't resist mentioning that there's a big election in Japan coming up this weekend, and the ruling party, the Conservative Party, has part of its party platform to double Japan's defense spending over the next. They haven't said over how much time, but over the next several years. I personally think that's very unlikely to happen because of exactly the factors that several of you have mentioned, that the pressure for Japan to deal with its pension obligations and also other demands of an aging society, I think is going to be too challenging. But on the other hand, my argument that there's a pressure to try to lock in gains early, I think comes into play here, because I think it's logical that the conservatives in Japan are trying to say, let's increase defense spending right away, because if they don't do it now, I think they're very unlikely to be able to do it later in this decade. So as a general comment, that would be one thing I'd like to say. Let me say a few other things a little more briefly. One clear difference, and my study is meant to be relational, and that's one of my contributions, is that instead of just looking at one country and the pressures of aging, because I'm interested in military security, it's a relational issue. And I think China does have an advantage of being an authoritarian state, that it can just assert certain things and not face quite as much pressure from the public. So, for example, China doesn't have the same promises for their pensions right now that Taiwan has or Japan has. And so this also gives, in principle, it gives China a little more flexibility about how to deal with its aging population. But at the same time, I think even an authoritarian country can't just say, sorry, old people, you're out of luck, we're not giving you any money. I think there are limits to what China can do, but it does have a little more flexibility that way. To get back to the very beginning set of comments, I like the framing about how it's not just about the people, but it's also about the family structure. And I very much agree with that. And I think that no other than your own Professor Pan had a similar insight. And that's why when we were together at the Wilson Center this summer, we came up with this idea of doing some experimental survey research to understand better the effect of one-child families. So far in the research we've done, what we've seen is that we can find survey data that shows how many children the respondent has, but we haven't found any data that says whether the respondent himself or herself is an only child or part of a multifamily. So we'd like to do some research that includes that. But I agree that that structure seems to make a difference. One area, though, that I guess I would just draw attention to related to family structure is the US case. And I think this is relevant somewhat to Taiwan as well. But in the US, we have certain regions of the country and certain types of families are much more likely to serve in the military than others. And that seems to cross class lines to some degree. And so even though there's some pressure nationally in the US for not as many people serving in the military, actually we've now had 20 years now of conflict with Afghanistan that the US has just withdrawn from, but we didn't find huge problems of military recruiting, even though we were in the midst of a war. It was predicted that would be a problem, but actually it wasn't the problem that was expected. So I think that does need to be factored in. There's so many other things that I'd like to talk about in response, but let me just say one thing, at least for this round. I really appreciate Professor Lin's comment that I think I saw a little more optimistic. And I also would like to stress that even though I think this demographic change is going to be a real challenge, and I think that more scholars need to pay attention to it as it affects their own issue areas, whether it's military security or pensions or economic policy, I agree that incremental change can make this manageable to a degree, and increasing retirement ages, giving more opportunities for women, changing roles somewhat to be more efficient. I think there are ways to manage this. Japan has shown this in their first decade of aging. And I think there are lessons that South Korea and Taiwan can learn from the Japanese case because Japan experienced it first. So one of the things I'm hoping to do with my book is sort of spell out some of these things that we've learned from countries that have experienced their first decade of rapid aging, to think about what's worked in a comparative perspective. And hopefully we can keep the peace, because that's the most important thing. East Asia has seen tremendous prosperity over the last several decades because it's been a very peaceful region. And I hope that that can continue.
Well, thank you Andrew, thank you very much for your talk and your responses. And also thank you for Dr. Lin, Dr. Zheng, and Dr. Yes for comments and questions. And this has been, unfortunately, the time is up. We wish we have more time to for more discussions about this interesting and timely issues of our time. So that will be end of our talk today. And thank you so much for joining us today. And we will very much look forward to Andrew's trip to Taiwan next summer. Okay, thank you.
Thank you very much.
Okay, welcome to.
Okay.
I'm sorry, I didn't hear that.
Yeah. Okay.
Thank you again.
Yeah.